So what happens when reality itself is just, well, too bizarre, too contradictory for standard realism? Can a fictional planet, something completely made up by scholars, actually start invading our world? Like, physically, can a man really prove God exists by floating after drinking hot chocolate? Seriously. And maybe the biggest question, why is telling the truth about a whole continent, its trauma, its history, sometimes only possible if you make it all up? Welcome to a new episode from our series, The Story of Literature from English Plus Podcast. Okay, so in our last deep dive, we were immersed in the world of 19th century Russian literature. Think Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, that intense, deep psychological realism. We talked about guilt, faith, suffering, how they took reality, even the gritty parts, and just plunged deep into the human soul. Their tools really fit that internal world.
Right, that deep dive into the psyche. And that approach, that kind of realism, it works brilliantly when you're dealing with the reality that, okay, it's complex, but it follows certain, let's say, stable rules, historical rules, physical rules. But then we shift focus, 20th century Latin America. And suddenly, we're looking at a completely different landscape.
Yeah.
Culturally, historically, just fundamentally different. And those tried and tested European literary tools, the idea you can just observe, document, write it down as it is, they started to fail spectacularly, really. They just weren't sufficient.
Spectacularly? What was so different on the ground there that writers felt they had to, tear up the rule book?
It was this brutal mix of forces, history, culture, all crashing together. It created a reality.
Yeah.
Just soaked in the surreal. I mean, think about it. You've got these gleaming modern cities right next to impenetrable jungles. You have ancient indigenous cultures, right? With ideas about time and reality that are totally alien to European thought. And existing right alongside that. The scars of colonialism, the violence, neocolonialism, it's all still present, very much alive. History, there isn't some neat line in a textbook. It's like this recurring nightmare. You get these utopian revolutions.
Hopeful moments.
Exactly, hopeful moments. Followed almost immediately by decades of brutal dictatorship. Regimes that literally erase people, erase history. A past isn't just past, it's like a ghost at the dinner table, as one critic famously put it. It's right there. So when official fact and deep popular myth are already tangled up in everyday life, how do you even begin to capture that with standard realism? It doesn't compute.
Okay, so the reality itself is sort of fractured, bent. And realism just doesn't have the vocabulary for that kind of beautiful chaos, maybe.
Precisely. And for a long, long time, the result was that Latin American literature was often dismissed, even by its own intellectuals sometimes, as just a pale imitation, a provincial echo of Europe. Writers were trying to cram this explosive, contradictory reality into these rigid European forms, and the results often felt, flat, constrained, not quite right. But then came the boom. We're talking roughly mid-60s to mid-70s, relatively short period, but boom is the right word. Huge impact. It wasn't just about style. It was cultural. It was publishing, a whole phenomena. Suddenly you have this generation of writers saying, no more. Rejecting that intellectual deference, they found this new voice, confident, innovative, intoxicating, a voice that knew their continent's complexity needed an equally complex, imaginative literature. They decided, sometimes the only way to tell the real truth is through invention. And the world started listening. Translations, prizes. People had to pay attention.
And that's our mission, to explore these pioneers, how they built these incredible worlds, these mythic structures, and why it fundamentally changed fiction everywhere. Now, to really get the boom, you can't just jump into those huge, sprawling novels people often think of first. You actually have to start somewhere quieter. Intellectual architect, maybe, the Godfather, Jorge Luis Borges. He doesn't fit the typical image of a literary revolutionary, does he? A quiet, scholarly, nearly blind librarian, working away in Buenos Aires, master of the short story, the essay, not the epic novel.
Right. It's a fascinating paradox. Borges wasn't really a magical realist in that colorful gobbo sense. You don't really find ghosts or levitating priests in his work. His revolution was intellectual, metaphysical, abstract. He wrote with this incredible precision, like a watchmaker, cold, elegant. He wasn't using fiction to explore, say, social dynamics or romance. He used it to probe the very nature of reality, time, infinity, the limits of what we can know.
His world was libraries, mirrors, labyrinths. It was all about the idea itself.
Exactly. Fiction as a vehicle for pure philosophical exploration. He created this intensely cerebral, almost mathematical, philosophical fantasy. And by doing that, he basically gave the next generation the intellectual permission they needed. That's key. Permission to break the rules of realism completely. He showed them you could be playful, incredibly smart, and build entire coherent worlds just out of thought experiments as long as the internal logic held up.
Okay, let's get into some of those specific thought experiments. Because reading Borges is like solving these beautiful, intricate puzzles. They stick with you. The Garden of Forking Paths, for instance.
Ah, yes, this is classic Borges on time. It starts out looking like a straightforward World War I spy thriller. The narrator, Dr. Yutsun, a Chinese professor spying for Germany.
Right, he needs to get a message out before he's caught. High stakes.
Very high stakes. But the story just blossoms. It becomes something else entirely when he learns about his ancestor, Chu Pen.
The ancestor who vanished to do two things: write an enormous novel and build an equally enormous labyrinth.
And here's the twist. The labyrinth is the novel. Chu Pen rejected the standard novel structure where a character makes a choice, turns left, say, and the other path, turning right, just disappears from the story. Chu Pen's Garden, his novel, is designed so that every event creates not one outcome, but all possible outcomes simultaneously.
Whoa, so the character turns left, but also turns right, and also stays put, all happening at once, branching endlessly.
Precisely. Infinite parallel realities unfolding within the pages of one book. Borges gives us a literary model of the multiverse. The narrator realizes that in one timeline, he might be the enemy of the person he's talking to, in another, their friend. Borges takes cause and effect, the bedrock of realism, and just shatters it into infinite possibilities. The message to future writers: don't just tell one story, think bigger, maybe tell all the stories.
That's mind-bending. And then there's Chlun, Ukbar, Orbis Tertius, that one. That one always gives me chills. Because it's not just about a fictional world, it's about it leaking into ours.
Yes, it's deeply unsettling. It's Borges playing with radical idealism, the philosophical idea that reality is purely mental, that things only exist when perceived. He imagines this secret society of scholars who create a massive, detailed encyclopedia describing a completely fictional planet, Tlun. It has its own history, its own physics, its own languages, everything.
And the people of Tlun, they're hardcore idealists, right?
Totally. Their main language doesn't even have nouns because nouns imply stable objects. They only have verbs describing processes, so if they lose some coins, they wouldn't say, "I lost the coins." They'd say something like, "There occurred a mental event of aggregation followed by disaggregation related to 12 coin-like perceptions." To them, our idea of a chair just existing when no one's looking is absurd.
Okay, strange but consistent. But then comes the creepy part. Objects from Tlun, things that should only exist in that encyclopedia, they start appearing here, in our world.
Start small. A compass with weird markings. A heavy cone-shaped object made of an unknown metal. These things, called tronir, shouldn't exist. But they start showing up, multiplying even, almost as if they're being willed into existence by people studying Tlön. Borges is showing how our ideas, our fictions, our intellectual games, they can have tangible, physical consequences. The line between our reality and a purely invented one just dissolves. It suggests our world is much more fragile, more susceptible to thought than we imagine. It's metaphysics turned into a kind of conceptual horror story.
Chilling. And we have to mention his ultimate metaphor, maybe the Library of Babel.
Ah, the library, yes. It's his grand statement on the human condition, the search for meaning. He envisions the entire universe as this vast, maybe infinite library. It's made of identical hexagonal rooms lined with bookshelves containing every single possible book that could ever be written using a basic alphabet of 25 symbols.
So, everything is in there. The cure for cancer, the true story of my life, the ultimate poem, absolute truth.
It's all there.
Yeah.
But because the library contains every possible combination of letters, the overwhelming majority of it is just meaningless noise. Millions upon millions of pages of pure gibberish, as he puts it. So the library is perfect, it's logical, it contains all truth, and yet it's completely useless for finding meaning. It drowns you in randomness. Borges describes the librarians living in this universe, their despair. Some become suicidal, some form fanatical sects. Burning books they declare meaningless. Others become obsessed inquisitors, hunting for the one perfect book that explains everything. It's a terrifying vision of searching for order and chaos. Borges, the librarian, took books, ideas, and turned them into cosmology. He built the intellectual maze. He showed how fiction could ask the biggest questions. The next generation, they'd take that maze and fill it with tropical ghosts.
Okay, so if Borges was that quiet, meticulous architect, the earthquake setting the stage, then Gabriel García Márquez, or Gabo, he was the volcanic eruption that everyone felt. This is the moment, right? Mid-60s onwards, when Latin American literature explodes onto the world stage, becomes a genuine phenomenon.
Absolutely. Borges was revered by other writers, a huge influence. But Gabo was the myth maker everyone read. His novel, 100 Years of Solitude, published in 1967. It wasn't just a bestseller, it was a global event. It felt ancient like scripture, but also utterly new. And it really defined, for the world at large, this style we now call magical realism.
So let's talk about Macondo, the setting for this epic, this mythical, isolated town. It's basically the stage for the entire Buendia family saga, right? 7 generations.
Yes, from its founding in the jungle, basically by accident, to its apocalyptic end. It's the whole arc of Latin American history compressed into one fictional town, a microcosm. Macondo starts in this state of almost prelapsarian innocence. Just a few families led by the patriarch, Jose Arcadio Buendia, looking for the sea, getting lost, deciding, okay, we'll build our town here. And the novel charts its whole life cycle. Isolation, then contact the gypsies, bring magnets, ice, early science, which feels like magic. Then civil wars, relentless cycles of violence. Then modernization, the train arrives, the telephone.
Bringing the outside world crashing in.
Exactly. And then ultimately, exploitation and destruction. It's the continent's story in parable form.
And the crucial thing about the magic here, it's not just sprinkled on top like decoration, is it? To really get magical realism, Gabo style, you have to see the magic as, well, inseparable from the everyday reality.
Absolutely inseparable. It's not like fantasy where magic is clearly marked, spells, special objects. In Macondo, supernatural is just the weather. It's the air they breathe. The world is this seamless fabric woven from the mundane and the utterly fantastic. And it's all viewed with this steady, unblinking gaze, no exclamation points.
Right, that tone. You mentioned that flat, unblinking eye, the way the most bizarre, reality-bending things happen, and the narrator just reports them like a journalist. Deadpan.
That deadpan acceptance is everything. It's the secret sauce. Take Father Nicanor, the town priest. He wants to prove God exists to the skeptical Colonel Aureliano Buendia. Does he use theology? Nope. He asks for a cup of hot chocolate, drinks it, and then just floats, levitates a few inches off the ground, holding the cup perfectly still. And the narrator describes this miracle with the exact same tone he uses to describe, the price of eggs or the afternoon heat. It's just reported. Fact.
Wait, so nobody freaks out? The priest is floating? Doesn't anyone call, the Vatican or the newspapers?
Nope. They just kind of nod. Maybe they're impressed, maybe mildly inconvenienced, but it's accepted with this weary resignation. Because honestly, in a place like Macondo, with its endless wars and its history that keeps vanishing, a levitating priest, it barely registers. It's just another weird Tuesday.
Yeah.
Or think about the deeper metaphors woven in, like the insomnia plague early on. Everyone in town stops sleeping for months.
Sounds awful.
It is. But the real horror isn't the lack of sleep. It's that the insomnia brings amnesia. People start forgetting everything. The names of objects, their own past, who they are.
So the plague isn't just biological, it's a metaphor for that collective amnesia, the historical erasure you talked about.
Precisely. And that's why Ursula Buendia, the matriarch, the one who lives for over 100 years and holds the family and the town's memory together. She's so vital. When the plague hits, she runs around town sticking little labels on everything. Table, chair, cow, trying to force people to remember basic reality. She's literally fighting against forgetting, tying memory to things you can touch. It's the struggle of the continent in one character.
Wow. And then there are those moments that aren't just weird, they're breathtakingly beautiful, almost poetic, like when the patriarch, Jose Arcadio Buendia, dies.
Yes. When he dies, it doesn't just rain water, it rains tiny yellow flowers. A silent, continuous shower covering the entire town. It's like nature itself is mourning in this uniquely Macondo way. A biological grief. And maybe the most famous example, Remedios the Beauty. She's so innocent, so otherworldly beautiful. She almost doesn't belong in the messy human world. And one day, she's just left folding laundry in the backyard, and she starts to rise, gently, ascends into the sky, taking the bed sheets with her. Gone. No explanation, no big fuss, just ascended.
It's incredible. And García Márquez himself always insisted, didn't he, that he wasn't just making this stuff up out of thin air. He'd say he was just writing down the reality he grew up with on the Caribbean coast. His grandmother's stories, where myth and fact were already completely mixed.
Exactly. He saw himself almost as a reporter of that reality, not an inventor of fantasy. He was reflecting the culture, not just creating a literary style for effect. And that perspective is crucial, because it reveals the deep social and political work the magic is doing. It's not just there to be colorful or charming, it's a necessary tool for social realism. Because woven right into these fantastical, beautiful, sometimes funny stories is the brutal, often officially denied political history of Latin America.
Which becomes painfully clear when the American Banana Company arrives in Macondo. That feels like a turning point.
Oh, it is. That's the fall from grace, the point where Eden gets paved over. The company brings progress, railways, jobs, But it brings ruthless exploitation, too. The workers are treated terribly, paid almost nothing. Eventually, they organize. They go on strike, demanding basic rights. Thousands of them gather peacefully in the town square, and the army moves in, opens fire, massacres them. Men, women, children, thousands killed. Their bodies are loaded onto a train, taken to the coast, and dumped into the sea.
Just horrific. But then comes the political magic, the state's magic trick.
The most sinister magic of all. The government, hand in glove with the company, completely denies the massacre ever happened, wipes it from history. They insist the workers just went home, peacefully. When the lone survivor tries to tell people what he saw, they don't believe him. They say he must have dreamed it. Or maybe the endless rain that followed the massacre washed everyone's memory clean. The state uses denial, gaslighting, official silence as a political weapon to erase its own atrocities. And that's where the solitude in the title hits hardest. It's not just about the Buendia family's inability to connect their cycles of fate. It's the deep political, cultural isolation of a continent whose history is so traumatic, so often denied, that it has to be told as myth. Magical realism becomes the only way to bear witness, the only truthful way to record a history that official channels insist never occurred. It's memory preservation through storytelling.
So this first wave of the boom, figures like Gabo, Vargas Llosa, Cortázar, Fuentes, it was, let's be honest, mostly a men's club.
Largely, yes. Very influential but predominantly male voices defining that initial phase.
But the next generation brought a really powerful shift. A new voice emerges, taking those tools of magical realism but focusing them through a specifically female, even feminist perspective, deeply connected to political upheaval. We're talking about Isabel Allende from Chile.
Allende's work is inseparable from her life story, particularly the political trauma that shaped it. The key event was the 1973 military coup in Chile. Her uncle, Salvador Allende, was the democratically elected socialist president.
Overthrown by Pinochet, leading to a brutal dictatorship.
Exactly, a dictatorship that lasted 17 years, marked by disappearances, torture, absolute terror. Isabel Allende herself was forced into political exile, living in Venezuela for years. That experience, the violent loss of her country, the separation, the urgent need to remember the victims, the disappeared that became the fire fueling her writing. It's the heart of her first and probably most famous novel, The House of the Spirits, which came out in 1982.
Structurally, The House of the Spirits feels familiar, right? Another big multi-generational family saga, the Truba family this time. But the emphasis feels different from Gabo.
It shifts, definitely. We still follow generations, but the central conflict isn't just about fate or history repeating itself. It's very clearly framed as a battle between entrenched patriarchal power and a kind of intuitive female resistance. We have the patriarch, Esteban Truba. He's volatile, controlling, a landowner who becomes a powerful conservative politician. He really embodies that old guard authoritarian masculinity that the Pinochet regime would later represent on a national scale. But the novel argues very strongly that the real strength, the resilience, the ability to survive and endure belongs to the women in his family.
Especially his wife, Clara, who is clairvoyant, and their granddaughter, Alba. And here, the magic feels very explicitly linked to being female.
It is female power. It's presented as this intuitive spiritual wisdom that the rational, often violent world of men simply cannot understand or crush. Clara talks to spirits, sees the future, famously makes the salt shakers slide across the dinner table with her mind. Her connection to the unseen, the domestic, the spiritual that's portrayed as the source of female strength. It allows the women to navigate and resist the brutality around them. The house itself becomes this kind of sanctuary built on their intuition.
The book starts with this almost whimsical, magical family story, but like Macondo, the outside world eventually intrudes, and the tone darkens dramatically as it approaches the 1970s. It becomes, well, harrowing.
The last third is incredibly tough reading. It shifts from family saga to direct political testimony. Allende gives a fictionalized but historically grounded account of the coup and its aftermath. The granddaughter, Alba, is a young activist. She gets arrested by the military junta, taken to a secret detention center, essentially a concentration camp, and is brutally tortured. Allende doesn't shy away from depicting the reality of state terror, and she draws a direct line between the private tyranny of the patriarch, Esteban, his history of violence within the family, and the public, political violence of the dictatorship. It's all connected. And this context gives the spirits in the title a much heavier, more political meaning. Yes, Clara talks to friendly ghosts earlier on, but by the end, the spirits are also, crucially, the ghosts of the dead and the disappeared. The thousands murdered by the regime, whose bodies were often never found, whose stories the state tried to erase. The novel, through its magical elements, becomes a way of keeping those spirits, those memories, alive.
So the act of storytelling itself, writing it down, even with magical elements, becomes an act of defiance, a way to fight back against that forced forgetting. You can't truly disappear someone if their story survives.
Precisely. Allende and others like her harnessed the power of the boom's literary innovations to create a testament, to ensure that the traumatic memory of political violence couldn't just be swept away by official narratives. It's literature as witness.
Now, after talking about Borges, Gabo, Allende, it's worth circling back to that term, magical realism. It became the shorthand, the label everyone used globally for this movement. But you mentioned earlier, many of the writers themselves weren't entirely comfortable with it.
No, they often felt it was, well, a bit reductive. Like, it implied they were just sprinkling some magic dust onto their stories to make them seem exotic or strange, maybe for foreign audiences.
Like adding a quirky flavor.
Exactly. And that minimizes the deep connection their work had to the actual lived reality of the continent. It wasn't just a stylistic flourish for them.
Which brings us to another term, slightly earlier, maybe more precise, proposed by the Cuban writer Alejo Carpentier. Lo real maravilloso. The marvelous real.
Yes, Carpentier suggested this, and it's a subtle but really important distinction. It helps get closer to what these writers felt they were doing.
Yeah.
See, magical realism kind of implies the writer is injecting magic into an otherwise normal, realistic world.
Okay.
But lo real maravilloso, the marvelous real, suggests something different. It suggests that in Latin America, the reality itself, the history, the culture, the mix of indigenous, African, European influences, the sheer absurdity of political life is already inherently marvelous, already surreal, already magical in a way.
So the strangeness isn't something the author adds, it's something the author finds already present in the world they're writing about.
That's the core idea. Carpentier argued that Latin American history is packed with events so epic, juxtapositions so violent, beliefs so ingrained that blend myth and fact, that the strange is the norm. The marvelous is just
But hang on, if reality is already that strange, why invent things like levitating priests or rains of flowers? Isn't that still imposing a fictional vision?
That's a fair question. I think the writer's response would be that while the raw material of reality was marvelous, the existing literary tools, mainly European realism, just weren't equipped to capture it properly. You might read about a bizarre historical event in a factual account, but standard prose struggles to convey the feeling, the texture, the cultural weight of that inherent strangeness. They needed new literary techniques like that deadpan acceptance of the impossible to make the reader feel the absurdity, the wonder, the horror of that reality as baseline, not as an exception. So they weren't trying to escape reality with fantasy. They were forging a new, more flexible, more powerful literary language to capture that complex reality more truthfully, in all its beauty and terror. They saw the 19th century realist novel as, frankly, inadequate for the job of describing the 20th century experience in their part of the world. They replaced an official history that often lied or erased with a literature that was impossible to ignore.
It really feels like the Latin American boom just reshaped the possibilities of fiction globally. It showed that literature could be incredibly innovative formally, playing with time and reality while also being intensely political and urgent. From Borges laying the intellectual groundwork, showing how to build worlds from ideas,
to García Márquez weaving myth and politics into this vast, unforgettable tapestry.
to Allende using those tools for searing feminist and historical testimony. It's an incredible arc.
They really prove that some of the most groundbreaking, truthful stories come not from the established centers of power, but from the margins. They created a literature that was simultaneously fantastical and profoundly true, playful and deadly serious. They showed the world that in places haunted by history, saturated with memory and trauma, sometimes the most magical stories are the only ones that feel truly real.
An absolutely staggering legacy, and it continues to ripple outwards, influencing writers everywhere. But maybe here's a final thought, something for you listening to mull over. Think about this. The major writers of the boom gabo, Allende, Vargas Llosa, Fuentes, they consciously chose to write primarily in Spanish, the language of the colonizer. They used that language to write back against the very political and historical legacies that Spanish colonialism set in motion centuries before. How does that dynamic play out elsewhere? You know, the strategy of using the master's tools, the inherited language, to critique, to reclaim, maybe even to dismantle the master's house. Where else in post-colonial literature around the world do you see language itself being repurposed in that powerful way as a tool for cultural resistance and telling truths that were previously silenced? Something to think about. And this was another episode from our series, The Story of Literature from English Plus Podcast. Remember that what we mentioned is just an introduction for you to step into the huge and beautiful world of world literature, so don't settle for what you have learned in this series. Start hunting for the hidden gems you can find in literatures all around the world. And don't stray far at the beginning. Start from your own culture and literature. I bet there's a lot of magnificent works of literature to be found right in your own backyard. Thanks for listening. Stay curious and never stop learning with English Plus Podcast.